Let me get this right. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Then I can do this. Good. So yeah, I've been really impressed with the Society of the Cincinnati so far. The building here, all the services. Andrew's been great. Rachel down in archives. And it's funny. I ended my first book talking about the Society of the Cincinnati, and so it's kind of a full circle to come back here. But today, I'm really excited to chat with you guys about my newest book, Under Alien Skies. I have it with me here. I realized I didn't put the cover anywhere in my PowerPoint today. So it's a beautiful cover. UNC did a great job on that. Now, before I actually start talking about the book, I want to reflect a little bit on how I got here. This is my third book, and whenever I finish these up, I like to think about where I started. How did I begin this journey? And the interesting thing with this one is I actually began this journey back when I was 16 or 17 years old, and I didn't realize it until I just finished this book. I grew up in a small town in central Kansas, and when America went to war in the Middle East after 9/11, a lot of the kids, the young men from my high school, went off and served in the military. Um, and when they came back, we were all really interested in their experiences over there. But they didn't actually talk about their human enemies. What they would mostly talk about is the environment and the climate and the weather and huge spiders and vast deserts and heat and storms. And I didn't think about that much, but it obviously got ingrained in my head because as I started reading these British and German soldiers' accounts of their experiences in America under alien skies, as I put it, I realized that they were saying the same kind of thing. And when I started looking into it, I also realized that we have all these environmental histories of the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, but no one had approached the American Revolution as such. There were some works on disease in the American Revolution. There have been a couple of recent articles on the production of things like saltpeter or military tactics affected by the revolution, by the environment. But no one had really looked at this. So this is what got me set off on this large-scale project. And today I'm going to go over in broad strokes what this book is about, how it's organized, and some kind of touch points. And this will invite larger discussion. And also, I hope show you that this is a much larger discussion that needs to be had. This is the first environmental history, the book-length environmental history of the American Revolution. As such, there's still a lot of meat on the bone. Quite honestly, I have plans for kind of a sibling book to this from a different perspective that we'll talk a little bit about in this talk today. So yeah, let's get right into it. Now, I want to start with a little vignette or a case study. This guy, talking about a mouthful. Richard St. George Mansert St. George. He was an Irish landlord, Irish nobleman who was born in 1752. But in 1776, at the age of 24, he traded in his duties as an Irish landlord, a British military officer. Now, just as he made this decision, he decided to have a portrait painted of himself, which speaks volumes. Here you see him in his full military regalia. He's leaning confidently on a cliffside with his faithful dog staring up into his eyes. And then, of course, a tall masted ship beckons him in the west to take him west, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is a picture of hope and confidence. He brought this hope and confidence across the Atlantic Ocean with him. In fact, as he arrives in America, he becomes very popular very quickly. St. George was a very artistic young man, very loquacious. He made a lot of friends. His best friends was a British man named, I went far too. Sorry, his best friend was a guy named General Sir Martin Hunter. And Martin Hunter described his friend as such. St. George and I were great friends. He was a fine, high-spirited, gentleman-like young man, but uncommonly passionate. He was quite military mad. St. George kind of saw it as his destiny and his duty to become this true military hero. As such, he charged into battles with aplomb, oftentimes at the neglect to his own physical, mental, and emotional safety. Now, at his first major battle, or at least one of the big ones, was the Battle of Brandywine. He described the battle afterwards, St. George did. There was a most infernal fire of cannon and musketry. The balls plowing up the ground, the trees cracking over one's heads, the branches riven by the artillery, the leaves falling as in autumn by the grape shot. He's describing the battle very much in terms of nature, the destruction of nature and being embedded in nature. Now, something that is very unique, though, about St. George is he was also kind of a cartoonist of sorts. He'd make these self-deprecating little drawings while he's over there. Now, this is his drawing of himself during a tempest around this time, him disdaining a cloak. His servant's trying to give him a cloak, but he's not taking it. The trees are breaking overhead. It's windy. So you have these two kind of basic demonstrations of how he's viewing the natural world. Here's the thing, though. As he continues in his battles, his friend starts to kind of worry about him. Hunter at one point says, "I often thought St. George actually wished to be wounded." Now, he almost gets his wish in Brandywine here. He gets shot in the heel, but he's fine. He kind of writes it off, no big deal. Well, he's not so fine during the Battle of Germantown. He gets shot in the head. He can't shake that off. His friends pick him up on the battlefield and drag him back to Philadelphia as fast as he can. While in Philadelphia, he has to get trepanned. He's wide awake. Hunter stands there next to him and holds his hand. He's astonished that he doesn't mutter or cry while it happens. After his trepanning, he draws another little cartoon. This is his reentrance and his glorious reentrance into Philadelphia, as he calls it. Here he is. You can see him there in the cloak, the blue cloak. He's slumped over, bleeding from the head. There are cannonballs on the ground. This is a far cry from his initial painting. He never recovers from this trepanning. Having a hole drilled in your skull will do that to you before modern medicine. And right after this, he has to head back to Ireland. Shortly after he arrives back in Ireland, he realizes he has deep physical, mental, and emotional scars from his time in America. From this time on, he wears a headscarf, very uncommon for a gentleman century, and dons long silken robes. This is a self-portrait that he does of himself at the time. He's haunting this almost afterlife, this other world with mournful figures in the distance. He regularly goes to different spa towns to try to find his health. He sulks around. His wife dies. He regularly visits her grave. He has another self-portrait done, an oil painting of himself at her grave. His friends talk about how melancholy he is and how he's talking, about depressing things all the time. And eventually, 1798 or 96, he's killed by Irish rebels when he tries to put down a rebellion in Ireland. The very ideas of the American Revolution had made their way back to Ireland, and that's the way he ends up dying. Now, this is a very evocative, illustrative example of kind of someone's experience experiencing war under alien skies, these environmental, emotional, physical, mental tribulations. But it's one among many. Today, we're going to be looking at these soldiers' experiences with the American environment. As I have here, for these soldiers, the American Revolution was a war of and against the natural world. My main thesis of this book is British and Hessian soldiers' negative perceptions of the world environment, which encompassing physical terrains, flora, fauna, weather, and climate, combined with harsh wartime realities to elicit considerable physical, mental, and emotional suffering among their ranks. So we're going to be looking at how they had these negative perceptions. Of course, now perceptions can become reality very quickly. And that combined with these actual realities to really fundamentally affect their ability to wage war. This is a facet that has largely been overlooked. So this kind of gets us to the so what of all of this. So why should we care? Well, for one, this is the first environmental analysis of human suffering in the American Revolution. It really humanizes these British and German soldiers who are oftentimes kind of depicted as boogeymen in this war, only kind of showing up. And, Americans at the time depicted them as such. Many Americans were worried that Hessians were cannibals who were going to come over and eat them. It dives into this specifically, looking at these strange physical terrains that they encountered, different plants, animals. We're going to look at climate, weather, and disease, which were considered a combined triumvirate at the time. And then kind of this idea of urban and rural. Now, another thing it does, though, is it goes beyond physical disease. Oftentimes when scholars talk about people's health during the Revolutionary War and other wars for that matter, they're really talking about their physical health, thinking about disease, military illness, wounds. But as I talk about in this book, emotional and mental illness was a real problem for soldiers during the American Revolution. They didn't have the same words to describe it as we do, but they're dealing with anxiety, depression, homesickness, suicides running rampant among their ranks. And finally, something this book does different is it looks at how the soldiers got here and then what they did when they got home. As I'll talk about, oftentimes in the American story, British and German soldiers only matter so much as when they arrive. The British are coming, the British are coming. The famous stories about seeing all these tall mast ships coming into the harbor. Well, by the time the British and German soldiers got here on these giant festering transport ships, they'd been at sea for 3 months already. They'd had this conversion experience. For them, the war had already begun, and it was going really poorly. Then, of course, when they go home, they bring all these traumas with them. We hear about this a lot in modern day, soldiers trying to come to terms with ordinary civilian life and after their military service. These British and German soldiers were no different. As I mentioned, everything. For decades before the American Revolution broke out, British and German young men and young women, of course, citizens, were hearing all about the New World. Now, the British and German people were getting different messages. For British people, they're getting a lot of negative messages. You had European philosophers for a long time debating these highbrow debates about how should we think about America's natural world. Buffon really had a problem with America, and then eventually Jefferson's going to come back after him. He said America exists in a desert and melancholy state, which will never produce anything but human creatures, plants, reptiles, and insects. And cold men and feeble animals are all that it will ever nurture. Well, meanwhile, in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, British troops come face to face with these realities. Now, it's important to note that most of the British men who fought in the French and Indian War, the soldiers, did not fight in the American Revolution. Officers sometimes did, but most of the men from Great Britain who fought in the Revolution had never been to America before. But they heard stories. Especially prevalent in the stories was General Braddock's horrible defeat at the beginning of the war, 1755. One of his soldiers later recalled, so this is an image here of Braddock's men trying to march into the backcountry, the Ohio backcountry, and you see here that they're just surrounded by endless forests. One of his men later said, 110 miles of an uninhabited wilderness over steep rocky mountains and almost impassable morasses stood in our way. Now, American colonists, meanwhile, are saying, yeah, we told you so. A Bostonian writes to the British Newcastle Weekly Current right after Braddock's defeat. This is and always will be the consequence of old England officers and soldiers being sent to America. They have neither skill nor courage for this method of fighting. They stand no chance. Remember my words. I do affirm that they send over 20,000 men from Britain. They will only fall sacrifice to the enemy. In this case, the enemy being the natural world more than anything else. Now, this is 20 years before the American Revolution breaks out, and you're going to hear the American people saying these same things as the revolution comes about. So you have this mid-century European smear campaign turning into real military. Now, Great Britain wins the 7 Years' War, okay? But they still have these kind of negative perceptions of the American wilderness coming out. Two great quotes that are really showing this, both from Henry Bouquet. Those who have only experienced the severities and dangers of a campaign in Europe can scarcely form an idea of what is to be done and endured in the American war. He continues, in the American campaign, everything's terrible. The face of the country, the climate, the enemy. There's no refreshment for the healthy, nor relief for the sick. A vast, unhospitable desert, unsafe and treacherous, surrounds them. For victories are not decisive, but defeats are ruinous. And simple death is the least misfortune which can happen to them. This forms a service truly critical in which all the firmness of the body and the mind is put to the severest trial, and all the exertions of courage and address are called out. For these British soldiers who go over to fight in the American Revolution in 1775 and 76, they're bringing these ideas with them. They've heard stories of veterans of the French and Indian War. They're reading newspaper articles of Braddock's defeat. Now, they're not some of the things that Buffon are saying are trickling down, but really they have these ideas. Now, the Germans, meanwhile, have been fed a lot of propaganda. A lot of them initially in the early 18th century see America as this place of opportunity. Ordinary people in Germany didn't have very many opportunities to move up or to get land. So you have these Hessian travel pamphlets being written. Kocherthal's full and circumstantial report in 1706 was really the first big one. It was meant to be read out loud, taverns, churches, meeting houses, and it was really encouraging people to come over. This is a coinciding image of the Carolinas and Virginia, where it shows all these rivers going in stream, animals, forests, mountains. It's this really happy place. There are not really very many dangers. However, by 1756, Middleburger writes his journey to Pennsylvania, where he flips the script. He basically says that the journey over there is horrible and dangerous. When you get there, it's horribly hard work. There's a strange environment. People don't like you. He's almost trying to dissuade Germans, or Hessians, because there was no Germany at the time, from coming over. So he details the horrible sea passage, all these variable weather patterns, a strange climate that can destroy your body and mind, and finally all these dangerous beasts lurking. So basically, by the time these soldiers set off, they have negative perceptions, some positive, but mostly negative. Now, Americans, meanwhile, are starting their own campaign. They're starting to boost their environment. Now, I mentioned earlier that there could be a sibling book to this. Originally, I wanted this book to be about German and British soldiers' perceptions and Americans, but I was trying to bite off more than I could chew. But I think there's a book in here talking about what Americans are saying too, because they're the inverse side of this coin. You have American Congressman George Wythe in 1775 saying, "No country exceeds us in felicity or climate or fertility of soil." South Carolina's state seal features prominently the palmetto tree. Now, the palmetto tree repelled British forces. Its soft, spongy trunks stopped British cannonballs, and they were able to repel the British forces with this. So they saw this as like this natural strength for them. And finally, they have poems like this, where they're basically saying that men like Washington are almost like have been given control of nature by the gods themselves. Now, beginning in 1776, you have around 80,000 men transported across the Atlantic, 50,000 British soldiers who are volunteer force, and then they hire around 30,000 Hessians. Now, around half that many camp followers come with them. So what we have here is one of the largest, most condensed migration events of Europeans to America up to this point in American history. You really kind of have this rediscovery of America going on, because you have all these soldiers and their camp followers, men, women, servants, women, children, because they come with them because they need their husband's money and they need to help him. And they're traipsing throughout the countryside. And they're facing constant challenges. They're distance from home, 3,000 miles away. How are they going to be provisioned? How are we going to keep morale up? But that's what we're going to be following today. We're going to be looking at what these people are doing, what they're experiencing, and how perception and reality are melding into this horrible cocktail. So chapter 1, nothing but sky and water around me, or oceans apart coming over, really starts this off and looks at what their experiences were being transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, most of these young men, usually between the ages of 18 and 30, many of them had never been on a boat, let alone sail across the ocean where they don't have any sight of land. They get piled on these giant transport ships. They're filthy, stinking, cluttered. They're sharing the space with animals, and now they're going to be at sea for 3 months. So this chapter really argues that this 3,000-mile multi-month transatlantic passage confirmed these troops' negative perceptions of the environment, and it served as this veritable kind of conversion experiences to all these natural hurdles that they're about to face. So basically, they're going to face physical terrains, flora, fauna, climate, weather, disease, all of this at sea. So by the time that they get to America, their war had already begun, and really badly. Now, some examples I give in this chapter are So as one of the soldiers, one of the Hessian soldiers sets off from Cork, he says that we surrendered ourselves to the rushing waters of the wild ocean. They really did feel like they were going to this great unknown. They're facing all kinds of new, novel, strange, dangerous, terrifying things. They're seeing things like volcanoes for the first time in the Caribbean islands when they start getting close enough, and other tropical islands. They're seeing icebergs that tower above their ships. All this strange flora and fauna, whales, spouting fish, porpoises, swordfish. They see phosphorescent algae out at sea and they're trying to do experiments on it. They don't know what this is. This horrible combination of weather, climate, and disease is hitting this. Crazy storms that they're absolutely terrified of. The thunderstorms, it's even scaring the sailors who are with them. Shipwrecks, changeable temperatures where it'll go from freezing to hot overnight. All kinds of disease, sickness, scurvy, bowel diseases, battles with other ships, collisions, fires, accidents. General von Riedesel was one of the commanders of the Hessian forces. He brought his wife and children with him. At one point, his wife was on deck of one of the ships and saw a sailor fall and basically just explode right in front of her and her children. They get sprayed with blood. I mean, it's that kind of those shocks of the senses as you're going over. And this all helps to lead to these mental and emotional trauma that they're going to deal with during the war. Boredom, anxiety, depression, homesickness. You have people committing suicide, throwing themselves overboard, shooting themselves. They'll stop eating. And this is just 3 months in. When they arrive in America, one of the first things they usually remark upon are the physical terrains. Now, I joke with my students about this. Imagine being someone who's born in the highlands and all of a sudden you're in some godforsaken swamp in Florida. We'll talk about the alligators in a minute. They didn't know what those were. Or these endless forests. In Germany and England, forests had been felled and controlled. They didn't have these old growth forests like we had in America. They also have other topographies like waterways and mountains that were far larger than they were used to, untamed, they call them, wild. As I say here, they bumbled and fumbled through these strange, often damaging landscapes in the fog of war. At the same time, their foes made their difficulties that much more distressing, cutting down trees, lighting fires, attacking them from the forests. One of my favorite examples of this is this Hessian captain, John Heinrichs. When he arrives in America at first, and this was common among Hessians, they'd arrive in America and say, well, this is great. This is this garden. Look what they have. Why are these Americans rebelling? How dare they? They're so ungrateful. Look what they have. As he says, he gets to New York and he says, this is the loveliest, healthiest, and most agreeable land on the face of the globe. No superfluous trunk, no useless twig, no unnecessary stalk can be found here. Describing it, New Jersey gets this idea of the Garden State this way. Flash forward a couple of years, he's had a rough time of it, battles, he's been enmeshed in the environment. His tone changes. My present ideas of America have greatly changed from those that I expressed in my last letters. If Penn were to offer me the whole country of Pennsylvania with the condition that I should live here the rest of my life, I hardly think I should accept it. And this the land of promise that they'd been promised by these travel pamphlets, the land where milk and honey flows and which so many have praised to us. This happens over and over again. You see it in places like New York City, where, of course, the American forces, the rebel forces, burn New York City to the ground right as they take it. Time and again, they're entering these environments, both urban and rural, that seem to chew them up and spit them out. Chapter 3 looks at flora and fauna. One soldier, at one point in the war, says that the very elements seem to conspire against us. This one argues that their interactions with wild creatures, snakes, large predators, insects, really remind them of how vulnerable they were. Meanwhile, they try to connect with plants. They poison them when they're starving. And I say here, nothing in America seemed to be trusted. Then they make matters even worse for themselves as they try to control the natural world around them. One of my favorite examples from this is a young captain, Horatio Nelson. This is before he's the famous Lord Nelson. He's sent to the Mosquitoes coast of Central America. 1781, or sorry, 1780. This is right after the French and the Spanish had joined. And he has a mission that he's supposed to go inland in this tropical river and invade a Spanish fort. Things go very badly for him and his men. For one, they've never seen a rainforest like this. The men are describing it, and as they're going through the river in these canoes, vines loaded with gay and fragrant flowers trailed over the chop. A brilliant bird sparkled, and for the first time, we saw the ugly iguanas looking curiously down upon us from the projecting limbs of trees. Now, this seems kind of romantic. Like, okay, they're going into the rainforest. It's different. Things go badly, though. A couple examples. As they get as they get closer and closer to the fort, the men are coming down with malaria and all kinds of sicknesses. At one point, they stop for the night, and the men are very thirsty, and they find this pool of clean, clear water, and they start to drink it. What they don't realize is it's right by this poisonous manchineel tree, which is pictured here, highly poisonous and toxic. It had dropped its fruit into the water, and so their throats start closing up, and they start to die. Luckily, their native allies are get away from here, and they give them some things to help them out. Shortly after that, a jaguar attacks them. As he says, the jaguar plunged headlong among the men, missed the one he was pursuing, and caught another by the neck, tore his clothes, and hurt his face. At one point, Nelson wakes up in the middle of the night and is caught, and there's an iguana on his lap, and a giant poisonous snake had slithered down to try to kill the iguana. So he rolls out of his tent and flails. They never take the fort, and by the time that Horatio Nelson makes his way back upriver, he has to go back for England for multi-months. He says that this has destroyed his constitution. He's sick for the rest of his life, and he really attributes much of his future sickness to his experiences in Central America. He basically thinks he never recovers from this. You also, of course, have the classic climate, weather, and disease. Now, it's important to realize that they considered climate, weather, and disease as all one. They all were in the same kind of arena. Say that revolutionary America was an astonishing place where old world notions of health and environment seemed to wither with a new case of dysentery, sky-splitting thunderstorm, and deadly winter. Now, once again, we have perception versus reality. The worst winter in recent memory did indeed occur in 1779, 1780 in America. You had the East River in New York City freeze over. There are ducks and geese whose feet are freezing to the ice. You have bobcats coming over the ice and attacking people in New York. They'd never known bobcats to come over there. So you do have these real weather events and things that are horrible, but you also have perception. Time and again, British and German soldiers saying, I've never seen a thunderstorm like this. I've never seen a snowstorm like this. And also remember, they're experiencing things like hurricanes for the first time. They've never seen a hurricane like this before. Earthquakes hit them. At one point during an especially bad storm in occupied New York City, an ammunition ship, a gunpowder ship, gets struck by lightning in the harbor and explodes. And it shatters every window on the east side of the river and knocks people to their feet. So it's just this constant barrage. There are fires happening all the time. Now, as I talk about in my book, different regions have different and seasons and climates. So I kind of divide America in these different areas. You have the blue here, they call it the frigid north. The green were the middle colonies. The red was the torrid south, including the coast and the Caribbean. And the purple was the coastal Atlantic. Now, no matter where they fought or marched or when, they complained constantly about the climate and the weather and different diseases. Okay, so that didn't change. Different seasons brought on all kinds of new pestilences. When Nicholas Creswell, so I use occupied New York City as a case study. It's great because the British held it from 1776 to 1783. It's the only major urban center they held throughout the whole war. And there were tons of people crowded in, so they lost a lot of records. Now, a loyalist named Nicholas Creswell, when he enters the city in 1777, he describes it pretty brutal. He says he sees soldiers in there. He says most of them very dirty and not a small number sick of some disease, the itch, pox, fever, flux. So that altogether is a complication of stinks enough to drive a person whose sense of smelling was very delicate and his lungs of the finest contexture into a consumption in the space of 24 hours. It is a filthy mess. Riedesel reflects, it is amazing what a human can bear and what all I endured after 3 years in New York City. New York City descends into a hive of suffering, horrible winters, pestilent summers, droughts, rainstorms that flood burned out buildings that create malaria. I dive more into it in my book, um, but it's this perfect kind of example of how they see this region, season, and climate all in one. And then you actually have these physical diseases coming out. Far more soldiers died during the American Revolution from disease than bullets or weapons. And British and German soldiers were even more susceptible to these New World diseases, especially in the torrid South, than were Americans because they were used to it. The British and Germans were absolutely terrified of the South. They really hated the West Indies and the Caribbean, somewhere my wife and I love to vacation now, places like St. John. But now I can never look at them the same way anymore because I read all these accounts where you have giant anacondas and stuff attacking these soldiers, and it's a different world. I should also mention too that when Horatio Nelson went upstream, they encountered a lot of alligators. They British and German soldiers were terrified of alligators. They were these apex predators, these dinosaurs. They and they were attacking men pretty regularly. Now, finally, chapter 5 looks at mental illness. And this is another place that this book, I think, makes some real strides. I talk about how they considered their bodies but minds unfit for this strange land. Their physical exertions just steadily overlapped with mental and emotional illnesses, anxiety, depression, homesickness, and suicide, creating this feedback loop of anguish, which sometimes proved fatal. Now, I have a lot of examples here. I can't get into all of them. I should say, though, that they had different words for these diseases back then. So melancholy was depression, nostalgia was homesickness, and then self-murder was suicide. One soldier said, I initially wished to spend different years here. I now suddenly hate this country. General von Kraft, a Hessian, in 1779 remarks, I cannot understand the circumstances in which I now find myself. I'm obliged to go through all kinds of misfortunes, even the most disgusting. I am in the saddest spirits. All my actions are at variance with my heart's feeling. My own self-examination and my mind are discontented with this. 1,000 different moods seem to conflict within me and trouble me. Then I become vexed at myself and disagreeable to others. How often do I deplore the harshness of my fate? And I am beside myself when I think of the consequences, namely that I am to be unhappy and unsuccessful without having a bad heart. This reads very much like a modern. It's very emotional. One point, a soldier stationed in New York talks about how so many of his colleagues are committing suicide that it seems like its own disease going around. You have instances of murder suicide where men are taking their family out in the forest and killing themselves, they're shooting themselves, they're drowning themselves, they're hanging themselves, they're poisoning themselves. For many of them, they feel like the only control they have over their life anymore is at their own hand. And this is something that's been almost totally overlooked in the American Revolutionary period. And much of it, I argue, can be attributed to their larger experiences during this war, of which the environment figured prominently. Now, don't get me wrong, war is and always has been hell. But for many of these British and German soldiers, they felt like they were facing a certain special kind of hell in the American Revolution because of the environment in which they were fighting. Now, finally, chapter 6 follows them home. I have this quote here. One of the British soldiers says, I have never enjoyed my health since my return from America. You have soldiers returning home where their families don't recognize them anymore. There were a lot of theories at the time that said that if you went to a new climate, it could change your very physical and mental being. It would make you a different person. And many of them felt this way. So this one says that, British and Hessian troops vanished across the Atlantic horizon or up in the frigid north in 1783. Rather, they struggled to come to terms with their harrowing experiences in America and often surmised that they could never achieve the same physical and mental fortitude of which they once boasted. For them, the war was far from over. And so I followed them back home across the Atlantic. It was a shorter trip because of the Gulf Stream, but they had to go back across the Atlantic Ocean again. And then they get home and they're not feeling good about this. So this is St. George again. So this is that image there of him and his wife's grave when he gets home. And this is a far cry from him 3 years earlier. Yeah, he's, it's just it's like, reverse order as I have here. So they have to sail home. And then as they get home, they don't feel like they fit anymore in the old world. One British officer and his men come into a town in England on their way back to London, and they're killing all these chickens because they're used to having to raid the countryside for chickens. And the people are getting mad at him. And he says he realizes they've become like rusticated in the new world, that they don't really know how to exist in civilized society anymore. For them, they kind of eventually, he says, they kind of adjust. Another one though goes to the Vauxhall Pleasure Garden to meet up with friends. They say, "Who are you?" They don't recognize them in body or mind. Oftentimes, you have soldiers going to balls and things and saying that they just can't enjoy it anymore. That I don't, they just feel out of their element. Now, interestingly, as they go into their pension, some of them are trying to get their pensions. And a major language that they're trying to get out of the military is the language, the terminology that they use is just worn out. Now, we can't know if that means for sure that physical or mental ailments, but time and again, they use that kind of vague language. A lot of these soldiers they're committing suicide when they're getting back. They have what we would call now PTSD. And they're trying to have some kind of close proximity to what they once had. Hessians are really treated poorly, ordinary Hessians. One Hessian, Johann Ewald says, "We muttered in our beards, cursed our fate, and bent our proud backs under everything because it could not be otherwise." Another Hessian mentioned that when he gets home, all the townspeople call he and his colleagues Americans now. The British military does learn some lessons from this. They end up kind of changing some of their military tactics, but you can't underestimate the fact that these were men who came home in their minds losers. And as I talk about in the book, a lot of them attribute their losses and immediate histories to the American environment. Americans, meanwhile, are continuing this narrative of American environmental superiority. They're saying the American environment isn't the problem. You Europeans are. We've become strong because of the American environment. It's made us better. It's made us exceptional. You're weak. Oftentimes we associate Americans doing this with Thomas Jefferson sending, mastodon parts across the Atlantic to try to prove Buffon wrong and saying, no, we do have large creatures here. But I would argue this American idea of American environmental superiority goes back much farther. And you really need to trace it to the American Revolution. Coming out of the Revolution, you have the Pennsylvania Gazette saying, the citizens of America are placed in the most enviable condition as the sole lords and proprietors of a vast tract of continent, comprehending all the various soils and climates of the world, which, by the way, the British saw as a bad thing, and abounding with all the necessaries of life. America seems to be peculiarly designated, if I could say that word, by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. Meanwhile, a German surgeon has the exact opposite conclusion. In 1780, Schoep says, perhaps those westerly gales, fogs, and mighty seas, which Columbus battled to reach the New World, were actually cast in the way of Europeans by a beneficent Providence as so many warnings to keep off. That we were never supposed to go over there. And the Americans would agree. For the next decade, or next century, up to this point, 2 centuries, the Americans used this language of natural superiority and exceptionalism. We are indeed, today, America has the most diverse biomes of any country in the world. But in the 18th century, the Europeans were trying to use that against them. And you see them flipping that here. So, wrapping this up, you basically have these British and German soldiers coming across the Atlantic to try to fight in this strange world. They have these negative perceptions going over, which of course can create this placebo effect anyway. Perception is everything. But realities live down to their expectations. And I would argue that you can't understand the defeat of the British military without looking at their losing battle, not just against their American foes, but perhaps even more importantly, against the environment in which this war was waged. So, do we have any questions? Yeah.
Terrific presentation.
Thanks.
Anybody who has spent a summer in London or a winter in Edinburgh or been in Ireland knows that the climate there is pretty brutal.
Yes.
So, and obviously, Germany is not any better.
Yes.
They had to move Oktoberfest to September because it was too cold in October.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that in terms of where they came from, what they were used to in terms of climate, and what they encountered here? Was it just that it was just so wet and wild, or?
It's a great question. So time and again, the German and British soldiers say these winters are totally different than at home. And I think much of it is just perception. Now, given, like I said, the winter of 1779, 1780 was indeed horrible. But, a friend of mine who does similar stuff said that, if you're on an island, eventually you'll learn to hate coconut trees and palm trees in the ocean, because you can't discount the fact that they were in this world fighting this war. They didn't like that. But it was a lot of perception. They just, in their minds, everything was worse there. You're right. They had harsh winters in Germany and England, but for some reason, in Scotland, for some reason, time and again, they just perceive it as worse. I and they are freezing to death, especially when they're in Canada. You see a lot of really negative up there. But even when they're down in the Carolinas, so when they go to Pennsylvania, they have this idea that it's going to be this perfect balance. That people like Benjamin Franklin have been touting it as that, and they say, look, even here is awful. So I think sometimes it's reality doesn't even really matter. It's just how they perceive it. And that's where that's what really got me into this was because I asked these same questions. I was like, well, it's not like it's warm in the Highlands in the winter. What's going on here? But it was their mindset. And I think it also links to this kind of decline. The Hessians felt forced over. They were a conscript army. They didn't want to go. And, I have to deal with the fact that some of them did indeed stay. But those who stayed, it was because they felt like they had no future in in their homelands. At least, even if the environment here was bad, at least they could have their own land here. And a lot of them fell in love with and married young American women, and that kept them around. But yeah, it was perception. Much of it was just pure perception.
Uh, Part of the British and Hessian reaction to the climate, to the environment, may have to do with their living conditions. I don't,
Totally.
could you describe a little bit? I'm sure nobody slept in a Holiday Inn, so
No.
the officers may have
Mhm.
had different living conditions than the enlisted men. And did the enlisted men have tents?
Yep.
Did they sleep on open air? I mean, what was the
It-
living condition
So,
like? Because that would have brought the environment sort of right in your
yes.
world.
Yeah, and so I get that a lot in the book. I mean, during the winters, they're basically digging holes in the snow and trying to create these little hovels. Uh, they're 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 intense. They're rain-sodden. They're sick. But also a really evocative example of this is at one point the British they camp out and they have a really bad rainstorm and they notice a weird smell. In the morning, they realize that they've camped on a not a very good graveyard, and it uncovered all these bodies around them of dead Americans that had been rotting. And so it's just that kind of, and there are all kinds of horror stories that they're dealing constantly too. So they have bad living conditions. They're seeing horrors. They're having to put down their beloved horses and things like that. But they're also seeing people get blown to bits and things. So they're feeling this. And they're always worried about food. The supply chains came from Cork, Ireland, and so they're always looking east across the Atlantic, hoping to see these provisioning ships. The Hessians get a lot of negative press because they're raiding a lot and taking things because they just don't. They're always worried about food too. So you also have this combination of poor living conditions. You don't know where your next meal is going to come from. You're losing your friends. You're having these, and so it all kind of creates once again this feedback loop. Um, and they have real mental, and it's amazing how open a lot of them too are about their mental tribulations, about being homesick, and their friends will come and try to help them sometimes, and they'll be ashamed of themselves, but they're also writing these little sad soliloquies in their diaries about it. And speaking of living conditions, at one point a guy's writing it his sadness, and he's suicidal, and he mentions he can hardly write because his ink keeps freezing because it's so cold in his tent. So and that's not even to talk about um, the British and American soldiers who get captured and they're on these prison ships and yeah, so that's definitely another big part of this. Okay.
You mentioned in your introduction that having finished this book,
Hmm.
that you're considering the similar on the American side,
Yes.
colonialist side.
Yes.
Well, what is your sense at this point as to what it will look like, or
Mhm.
what did it look like on the colonialist side?
Yes. They dealt with a lot of the same things, but it comes back to this perception. So they had all this positive press, and especially when the French joined, they feel like they're fighting. They have this kind of rage militaire, as one historian has called it. They feel like they're fighting for the right things. And don't forget, they also have the benefit of hindsight. So sometimes they're writing after the fact and they know that they've won. But I mean, I talk about this in my book. Washington is forced to do smallpox inoculations during the war. It's not like his men are immune to this. Now, some of them, they do have higher thresholds for certain physical diseases than do their British and German enemies. But I mean, you have the famous Valley Forge example. That's not great. But when I started doing the work on suicide, mental health issues, American and French soldiers are committing suicide at an alarming rate as well. And French troops are also having to season themselves to this new world climate. But for them, they're not over as long, there aren't as many of them, and they win. And so those are three kind of fundamental differences there. But what I would definitely try to do from the American side is really try to say, look, the Americans dealt with a lot of the same things the British did. And so, for some of these American troops, if you were born in the Southern colonies, Boston seemed like a whole different country to you, different people, different places, everything. So they were facing their own new worlds in that way. But they're doing it with this constant fire hydrant feed of positive press about how they're doing the right thing, they're better, they're superior, they're predestined for this, they're fighting for a republic, nature's republic, and how it gets this kind of conversation started. So that's what I'm kind of thinking there, because oftentimes, as I mentioned, we start talking about American exceptionalism and kind of defensiveness from a natural standpoint, an environmental point with Jefferson. When he doesn't like that Buffon has been saying these things about America, that it doesn't have any big animals and things. And he's literally shipping animal specimens and fossils and things across the Atlantic to say, no, you're wrong. But I think it goes way back. It goes farther than that. I mean, you saw even after the French and Indian War, where you have that Bostonian saying, yeah, the Europeans aren't cut out for this. So
I know we're talking about the 18th century here,
Mhm.
but was there any significant difference between the medical care in the two armies?
that's a good yes, because yes. So the British, they were trained soldiers and they had trained military physicians. Now, a physician at this time was not a physician now. They basically would have, this is something else, they would have followed another physician around the hospital for a while and read some books. Um, there's a famous quip, I can't think of the author, but basically like heal, basically it's a joke that basically my doctor killed me. Like my doctor healed me to kill me kind of idea. They didn't really know what they're compared to now, like they're bloodletting. But I would say they had better structure and infrastructure. And kind of an interesting parallel here. During COVID, they transformed Central Park into a COVID hospital. Well, during the American Revolution, the British transformed their pleasure garden just outside of the town that was renamed after the pleasure garden in England, Vauxhall, into a military hospital. So they had much more trained military physicians, at least as far as military went. But also at the same time, the Americans were the ones who figured out well, they didn't figure it out. They stole it from enslaved African people, but the inoculation process for smallpox. So I would say that just the British had more training on the matter, but they were also having to ship people 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. So the Americans had more grassroots stuff going on. So it kind of shakes out both ways. And then the Hessians, of course, you had Shope there, who I quoted, who was one of these officers. And I start off my book with this quote from him where he's basically saying that the war is different here, and my medical theory doesn't really work over here. Everything I've been taught kind of just falls to the wayside. So they had better in theory, but in practice, I would say it kind of crumbles. Yeah. Hey.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Would you like our questions together, by the way, as we're right next to each other, rather
Sure.
than one at a
Yeah,
time?
sure.
Okay, so my question is whether by the time we're getting up to the War of 1812,
Mhm.
so it's a full generation later, but presumably some of the folks who had a really terrible time during the Revolutionary War
Yes.
would be around. Did any of them write sort of similar op-eds
See-
or comment pieces saying this isn't worth it?
You read my
Trust me,
mind.
I was there and this isn't worth it.
So this is what I've been thinking where I'd go with this. So I'm really interested. I haven't looked into this. So I'm really interested to see what the rhetoric is around the War of 1812, because this would be a real kick in the teeth for them, because they've been celebrating this American natural superiority. And then I always tell my students, America didn't win the War of 1812 in so much as we managed not to lose it, kind of deal. And so this would be like, and I really would be interested to see what people say about this, what the Americans say when they get invaded by the British again. The White House gets burned down, which is kind of a favor in some ways. But, and how do you, and so that's where I'm going. So I have those same questions. Oh, of the British soldiers. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of them were already stationed in Canada. They'd been up there for a while. But this is also kind of getting out of my expertise zone. I always joke that kind of once the American Revolution ends, we're kind of out as far as but that's where I'm gonna have to go next. I'd be really interested to see that. And so that's what I have a book project I'm writing right now, but that's gonna be my next kind of, that's where I'm going. So yeah, you read my mind though. I think that there's something interesting there to look at from beginning of the American Revolution through the end of 1812, and how they kind of, and you have Jefferson in there, then you end with Jack. So I think there could be some really interesting stuff there.
My question is actually more of a comment. It seems to me that the narrative of Joseph Plum Martin
Mhm.
on the American side
Yep.
is really an environmentalist argument
Yes.
of the kind that you asked. And without the patriotism, I mean, there really isn't
Yep.
a surge of patriotism that you
Mhm.
implied. It's disease, environment, cold,
Yes.
year after year.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned that. My senior capstone project in undergrad was, I talked about Americans' tribulations and sufferings during the war. And of course, Joseph Plum Martin was one of my main subjects. But for even him after the war, he comes together with his comrades, like his band of brothers, kind of a sense of pride. But yeah, he definitely kind of bucks the trend there. So some of the stuff I've been saying with my American argument still kind of, it's hypothetical. So I would really have to kind of dive into that more. But from what I've done, from what I've seen, you have what soldiers are experiencing on the ground versus what the press and the politicians are saying otherwise. And they're these very conflicting messages. Whereas from the British and German cause, the soldiers are saying this isn't good. And a lot of the commanders are also saying this isn't good. In fact, a lot of the officers, they start trying to get out. They start taking early leave. They're like, I don't feel good. And they go back home. And the rank and file don't have that option. So yeah, I agree. I mean, the American soldiers suffered a lot too. And they deserted a lot. It's easier to desert when you're fighting a battle 10 miles from home, and the British soldiers didn't have that option. So
Yeah, I find it really interesting. You're talking about the divide between the experience of the American soldiers and the portrayals in the media.
mhm.
I'm wondering, I have heard that sort of the soldiers were paid with sort of land grants
Mhm.
at times with tracts in the West.
Yes.
I'm wondering if, the media and the upper brass sort of had a economic incentive of portraying that land as better than it was.
Of
And if you
course.
think that was or like the fact that land in America sort of had a different role for people living in America as a source of advancement. And if you think that contributed to that at all.
For sure. Yeah. And this gets into George Washington spent his whole adult life trying to take the Ohio Valley. He started the First World War over it. And then, of course, commanded the forces of revolution. And then his first act as president was to march west in the Ohio Valley. There was a incredible hunger for this land. The issue was these soldiers, they would get these land grants a lot of times, and if they were paid at all, they were paid in depreciated continental currency, and they were oftentimes treated really poorly after the war. And they ended up losing their shirts a lot. They sell off their land for depreciated currency, or they sell off their currency. So they're definitely going to try to boast that land. It's also a way, of course, driving off their Native American enemies and pushing this idea of civilization, which eventually, gets called manifest destiny. But yeah, it was definitely in their best interest to promote this land. It's this great thing because they wanted it too. They wanted to buy it and resell it. So yeah, I would definitely say there's that element to that.
Hey, thanks. I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
I couldn't help but think about the American soldier in Vietnam
Mhm.
as being highly analogous, and
Yes.
both in terms of perception and in reality.
Yes.
And I imagine all you can. I thought I'd just ask you what if you've thought about that.
Yeah. So this is a really a tightrope I had to walk because I thought the same thing. And I did some research that's been done with modern soldiers coming back from wars that have been fought in foreign wars in strange environments like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and how that's affected their mental stability. But also you make they lost in Vietnam too. So the Americans lost in Vietnam. So when they come home, just like the British and German soldiers, and the Germans worry about that, and the British coming home that we lost and people are gonna like throw things at us. But yeah, it's very analogous in that you have this supposedly superior force traveling vast distances, many of them going who are conscripted and don't necessarily want to be there, and fighting a supposedly inferior group who knows the land better than they do and ends up beating them in this way. So I thought about that a lot. And there have been a lot of environmental histories of the Vietnam War. But I would argue that it was just as shocking, if not more shocking, for a lot of these British and German soldiers to come to America as it would be for American soldiers to go to Vietnam. They're facing the same kinds of things. Now, I also want to mention it wasn't all bad all the time. They had pleasant moments where they saw a pretty sunset or like bit into a peach or I didn't know. But that's not what they highlight as their experiences then and after. Some of that's probably, as one historian's called it, a pornography of pain, that sometimes they know that a lot of them wrote this knowing that people are going to read it. So they want to kind of create this. But also that was their lived experiences. War's hell. War's always been really bad. And I think this also cuts, somehow the American Revolution still in our national memory almost has this, I won't say bloodless quality to it, but it's kind of this glorious cause, and we don't always think of it that way. But it was really bad. I've read some accounts, that idea of, bodies coming up is hardly the only example of people just like now. It was awful. And a lot of the people who did die, British, German, American, and French, they didn't die gloriously on the battlefield. They died of dysentery in their tent by themselves or while their friends stood around. There's a famous, have you guys ever read the guy Fithian, his journals? He was a tutor in South Carolina. He joined the American cause as a minister. And I read his whole diary, and all of a sudden it just ends. Well, then there's a letter tacked on. His friends wrote to his wife, was like, "Hey, he got sick and he just died of dysentery." And there's that kind of stuff where and so it was a really traumatic, horrible experience for all these people.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up.
Yeah.
You hit the nail on all the heads with the questions on Zoom. So yeah, I was going to ask you what your biggest takeaway was from the book, and there you go. So
War's bad.
Yeah, there you go.
But also the environment's a major part of any war throughout time and space. Thousands of wars have been fought, and the environment's always a major consideration of both of mental, physical, and emotional wellness in that.
Very good. Dr. Scribner, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us tonight. Thank you all for attending in person and joining us virtually on the home. Get home safe, and we'll see you next time.